Technicians of Spaceship Earth, welcome to Binge Warriors, your guide through the technosphere that is the Psychedelic Warriors discography, one album. In the company of a long-term fan, which is me, and your favourite first-time listener, which is Matt in Berlin. Matt, how you doing?
I am very, very, very warm, Andy. Thanks for asking. It's 31 degrees today, so I'm in a room which is trying to be as airtight as possible to give the best recording possible, but it also means that I'm a big sweaty mess. But apart from that, everything else is great.
Excellent. Well, we've got another interesting one today. We face the is it canon or not question. The answer, of course, is that if it looks like it's a side project and it sounds like it's a side project, but Wikipedia says it's canon, then it's canon. So that's how we determine such things. And there are one or two albums around in the 90s which may or may not have been in that list, but are actually not. Palace Springs, that we touched upon, I think, last time, that has some studio recordings on it that we will come to probably in the end of decade wrap up. And The Business Trip is the other one that's been referred to, which has some things on it which haven't been heard before. Rest assured that these things will get an airing and they'll give us plenty to choose from when we start looking at our non-canon studio album orphan tracks type playlists at the back end of the decade. Nobody got the Frank Zappa reference from the end of the previous episode. Some people thought it was the beginning monologue from the track White Zone, but it was not. It was Frank Zappa from the opening of Joe's Garage and the central scrutinizer referencing the White Zone being for loading and unloading only. So we've both been listening to the White Zone. I have a feeling that I've listened to White Zone more than I've listened to It Is the Business of the Future to Be Dangerous. But it's a low bar in terms of my listen count on that. So it's been interesting to have this one on repeat for all that time. But it's not all that I've been listening to, Matt, and I suspect it's not all that you've been listening to either.
That is very true. It's festival season again in Berlin, and there's a festival which I have not been able to get to this year but have been to previously, which is called Melt, which is in a area of Germany called Ferropolis, and it's quite an amazing venue because it's full of huge, I mean literally like Titanic levels of earth-moving equipment, the kind of things that would excavate tunnels out of mountains, big spinning blades as tall as a 6-story house. It's quite incredible to see. And for some reason, when they were discontinued and no longer needed, they were all put in this one place, and they've now been turned into giant stages and places where people can DJ from, and they put lights and fire equipment and stuff all around it. So it always makes for quite an amazing venue, and Melt happens around this kind of time. That put me in mind of a couple of things that I'd seen from festivals there and also festivals back in London. So I've got two picks from memorable times, both in Berlin and London, from the festival circuit. And the first one is from Melt, and it's actually a British band called London Grammar. I had never heard of London Grammar before seeing them at Melt, and I wasn't even expecting to see them. I had gone to a particular stage to see Miss Kitten play, and at the end of her set I decided I didn't really want to go anywhere, and I didn't have anyone else on my list to see at that particular time, so I thought I'm just going to go and see who the next band on is, and it was London Grammar, and they came and started to play, and I think my jaw was on the floor for a whole hour. It was quite amazing. The singer Hannah Reid has a voice that just became my world for an hour. Her range is incredible. Her vocals and delivery are haunting and have this strange kind of sadness to them that's so compelling. As soon as I heard them, I knew that they were going to be a band that I needed to get to know. The track that I have picked is from their second album called The Truth is a Beautiful Thing. The track is called Oh Woman, Oh Man. And if I have to just pick one track from their amazing discography, I pick this one because I think it covers a lot of what I love about the band. These searing, haunting vocals, these hands in the air melodies, this big unison chorus that they are able to make as a three-piece, and just being able to switch from melancholic to euphoric on a dime. It's always quite an experience, and I'm very glad to have seen them live and to be able to share that with our playlist listeners.
Very cool. I'll look forward to that. I haven't heard any London Grammar, but they're a name that keeps coming up in articles that come my way on Google News and such like, so I'll have to listen to our playlist myself. Of the two things I've got today, one of them is very, very old. One of them is practically brand new, and I only received it having pre-ordered it a couple of weeks ago. You may remember when I discovered Mythic Sunship. They were a Scandinavian band, I think Danish, on a label called El Paraiso. And on a whim, and I can't really remember why I did it, I went to the El Paraiso web shop and discovered that the people who started and run El Paraiso are in several of the bands on El Paraiso, not Mythic Sunship, fun enough. They mostly come from a band called Causa Sui, and I might be butchering that. It is Causa Sui, Causa or Causa Sui. And again, they are from Denmark, and they've done quite a few albums over the past 10, 15 years. The new one is called From the Source, and the only thing I can really compare it to is the kind of psychedelic rock that we heard from bands like Colour Haze, maybe. Karma to Burn springs to mind, but I'm not sure if they were that or not. But this is slightly lighter than either of those two. Very psychedelic. There's some kind of organ in there, bright guitar. Not an awful lot in terms of fuzz or heaviness, but beautifully done. Really, really good. Definitely getting me inspired to go through their back catalogue. And actually, a number of the other bands that people in Causa Sui are in are also brilliant. I did a bit of a binge on El Paraiso artists and bought a few records. So you can expect more El Paraiso artists to be hitting the playlist at some point. So this album is called From the Source, and the track Sorcerer's Disciple, which is the first track, will be hitting the Hawkbinge Sessions playlist.
It's always nice when you find something which brings you into a new label or genre or something which gets you really excited to plumb the depths of all of it.
Absolutely.
My second track is Massive Attack. I'm not going to be able to say anything about Massive Attack that has not been said before in their illustrious 35-year career, but safe to say they're one of my formative bands, and obviously one of the formative bands of the whole trip-hop genre in the 90s and beyond in general. I didn't get to see them until a bit later in life, but one of their biggest performances I did see them was at the British Summertime Festival in London. It was amazing to see them play live, and I wanted a track from that tour that we saw to commemorate part of that UK festival vibe. I think Teardrop would have been the obvious one, but I actually want to include a different track, which is Angel, because when I saw them at British Summertime, Horace Andy, who is the vocalist of that track, came to do his vocal for the song, but he had actually injured his foot and had gone to hospital, and they actually got him out of hospital to come and sing this song, and they wheeled him on stage with this huge leg cast in a wheelchair, and he just sat there and just sang his part of the song while the rest of the band went crazy around him, and then everyone really gave it up at the end for his efforts, and then at the end he just said, "Thank you everyone, now right back to hospital," and they wheeled him off again. I just thought that was an amazing commitment to the performing arts. So Angel is a great track in its own right, of course. It's got this amazing brooding tempo, it's got this vibe of trip hop, but also replacing that normally dominant electronic sampled feel with a full drum kit and really grungy guitars. So I think it also makes it a perfect track to add to the type of playlist that we're curating. So that's Angel by Massive Attack from the album Mezzanine on Virgin Records.
That's a good memory and good restraint on your part, because I do know that Teardrop is basically your favourite track of all time. And I remember us going to see Massive Attack, so it's almost a surprise that it's taken this long for Massive Attack to find its way onto the playlists. My second, this is the really old one, and it's pretty jazzy, but it's a very different type of thing. I mean, I added Herbie Hancock, I think, to the playlist last time out. This is Alice Coltrane, and Alice Coltrane is the wife of John Coltrane, the saxophone player. But she was a harpist, and her big album, if you like, her Dark Side of the Moon, is an album called Journey in Satchidananda from 1971 on Impulse. And it has psychedelic vibes to it and kind of cosmic overtones because it has the harp playing these beautiful washes all the way through, while the band, which also has Pharoah Sanders in it, who passed away fairly recently, absolutely brilliant player on it. So it's a fantastic journey, and you can just put it on and get completely lost in it. Really beautiful album. Doesn't feel to me like the kind of jazz that I was listening to with Herbie Hancock earlier, Miles Davis, these kinds of things. It doesn't really have the same horns going against each other all the time, lots of solos, all of this. It feels much more something that you really sink into. So we've covered 4 very, very different things there between us, Matt. And now we're going to go on to what we've heard from people out there. But before we do that, we have something else to talk about, which is this new book by a man called Paul Garbutt, who's not only a long-time listener to Hawkbinge, but a very long-term fan of Hawkwind. And he has released a book basically about the most recent era of Hawkwind. It's called The Second Golden Age of Hawkwind, 2017 to 2023, subtitled The 11th Second of Forever. And it's a beautiful little book. It has listings of all of the gigs that he's been to, which is well over 100 of them. Some contributions from people such as Oz Hardwick, Brian Torn, people who've had quite a lot to do with Hawkwind or are just massive Hawkwind fans. It has Paul's thoughts about the most recent albums and his top gigs and all these things. It's a very personal journey from Paul. So it's not attempting to be another Sonic Assassins or another Days of the Underground. It's very much its own thing. But it's a lovely little book. And obviously the main reason to buy it is because Hawkbinge is in it. We give a few thoughts around Hawkwind and what it means to us. There's a photograph of us in it. And if that doesn't put you off, nothing will. So it's a lovely little book. I told Paul that I'd give it a mention, but I would have given a mention even if I hadn't met Paul and if Paul was not the lovely guy that he is. So The Second Golden Age of Hawkwind, and that'll probably be quite useful to us in a couple of years' time, because obviously these most recent albums that we've done our reaction podcast to, there's nothing in the books that we have to refer to them. So now we do. So well done, Paul. Congratulations there. And what have we heard from everybody else, Matt?
Well, Andy, I can take your book and raise you another book, because back in April, a Mr. Tim Forster emailed us to say that he was writing a book on Robert Calvert and would we talk about it if he ever got around to finishing it, which of course we said yes. And glad to say now that he has finished it, and by the time you're hearing this, it will be out. It's called Robert Calvert Through His Work, and it's a semi-academic study of the multidisciplinary art practice of writer, singer, lyricist, poet, actor and novelist Robert Calvert, probably most famous for his work with Hawkwind in the 1970s. As it says in the book, Robert Calvert's work covered a broad spectrum of subjects over a period of 20 years. Robert was an artist in continual dialogue with the world around him, and therefore this book contextualizes his work by outlining the rapidly changing political and cultural situation that he inhabited. This book considers Robert's art practice from his early involvement with Friends and 1971's Hawklog and his 1984 solo album Freak. I think it's a really interesting book as a piece of literature that is going into a fantastic artist who is sadly not given the attention that he deserves. Oz Hardwick has, I think it's either a foreword or a review, I'm not sure, but Oz has said of this book that a product of his time, upbringing and circumstances, this first major study shows how Calvert's work in diverse arts enacted an ongoing interrogation of society viewed through a compound lens of eclectic intellectual and pop cultural enthusiasms. The picture that forms is of an artist in perpetual conversation with his environment, with an uncannily sharp eye for, as he put it, things which haven't quite happened yet. So that's Robert Calvert Through His Work by Tim Forster on KDP Publishing, and it will be out by the time you hear this. So if you're interested in hearing more about the formative artist for Hawkwind, Robert Calvert, then I would recommend you check that out. I will certainly be doing so.
Yeah, me too. And obviously when we eventually finish the Canon studio album run, then some of these solo albums will very much become our focus, and Robert had a few of those, so maybe the book will get a mention. Tim, you're just going to have to be very patient.
I've just cherry-picked a few other little things from people before we get on with the show. First of all, we had an email from Ian Peary, who said that he discovered Hawkwind when his cousin invited him to go and see the band play live when he was just 14, so that's a formative memory created right there. He said, your podcast has made me dig back into the old records and also explore everything released after I kind of lost touch with the group. So glad you're with us on the journey, Ian. Thanks for writing. Similarly, on YouTube, on the It Is the Business of the Future to Be Dangerous episode, Ravenscroft Dave put a comment in saying, "Well, thanks for making me look at this album in a whole new light. I had been casually enjoying it as a nice background ambient music for 30 years and suddenly it's come alive." So I think that's, again, one of the best compliments that we can get for making people not only thinking about a track which maybe they hadn't heard, but maybe hearing something that they are even listening to a lot in a new way, which is amazing. And on Facebook, we had a message from David McKinnon who said, "You are helping me through a miserable experience with chemotherapy," and he hopes to be well enough to see Hawkwind play at the New Day Festival in Kent this year. And David, we wish you a fast and full recovery, and let us know if you end up going, as I think we're planning on being there too, right, Andy?
We are indeed. It'll be hard to top David's message in terms of the kind of most touching things you can be told by someone. David, that must be horrible. It's amazing that we're able to provide even a little ray of sunshine in all of that. And we would love to meet you at the New Day Festival where we are going and get you a drink. So hope to see you there.
Very last thing from me is to say thank you for everyone who impulse bought a Hawkbinge t-shirt since the last episode. We've had a little flurry of sales, which has been really nice for us, but also we've been able to make our first bee donation. So thanks everyone who has got one so far. They will be perpetually available if anyone ever feels like supporting us for some reason on their person, but also would just like to do something nice for pollinating insects. They'll always be there. The link will always be in the description, and we'll be updating our designs if inspiration or new seasons come to us.
Indeed, yeah. Oz and Ian Abrams both sent pictures of them proudly sporting. I say proudly, I've added that myself. Sporting their Hawkbinge t-shirt. So thanks for that, guys. And yes, it did allow us to make our first Hawkbinge community donation to the British Bee Charity. And let's hope that there are a few more. So now let's get into 1995. 1995 is an interesting year for Hawkwind because actually this is not the only album that gets released. This one is released earlier in 1995, but later in 1995, Alien 4 comes out, which means we have 2 consecutive podcasts from the same year. Which means I've got a whole bunch of albums that were released this year that I will use to take us back into 1995, and I'll use the first half of the year for this podcast, and then when we come back for Alien 4, we'll go through the ones that are released in the latter half of the year. So in the first half of 1995, we get The Rapture from Susie and the Banshees, Second Coming from the Stone Roses, The Great Annihilator by Swans, Octopus by Human League, The Sky Moves Sideways by Porcupine Tree. So it's a very early Porcupine Tree album, but one that I'm a big fan of. Dogs of War from Saxon. Left Field released Leftism. A couple of debuts here. Blink 182 released Cheshire Cat, and Elastica have an eponymous debut LP. Huge album for Radiohead. The Bends comes out in 1995. Moby releases Everything Is Wrong. The Orb release Orbis Terrarum. Massive album, love this one. Monster Magnet, Dopes to Infinity. Also, being a big Faith No More fan, King for a Day. Elton John releases Made in England. King Crimson release Thrack, which is their double trio album. White Zombie released Astro Creep 2000, which I believe is the album that features More Human Than Human, which is a brilliant track. And just thinking out loud right now, I can see that one coming to a playlist near you. I Care Because You Do by Aphex Twin is this year. Take That release Nobody Else. And Paul Weller releases Stanley Road, one of his big albums. So there's a whole bunch of albums there just released in the first half of the year. The huge singles from the entire year of 1995. This is the year of Gangsta's Paradise by Coolio. Also the year of Boombastic by Shaggy. Sadly, it's also the year of Back for Good by Take That. Michael Jackson releases You Are Not Alone, and U2, Hold Me, Thrill Me, Kiss Me, Kill Me. Those are the 5 top-selling singles of 1995. So hopefully that takes you all the way back to those heady years of the mid-90s when this one is released. So White Zone is released. It is Dave Brock, Alan Davey and Richard Chadwick, and they are joined by Dave Charles using the sampler. So it's kind of a 4-piece. Paul Cobbold might well have assisted in production. I saw that reference somewhere, but it's not one that's repeated often. So I think Paul Cobbold is involved in this. It is released on the Emergency Broadcast UK label, which is the band's own label for side projects and oddities, and Griffin in the US. Now, I've got 2 release dates for this. One is in February and one is in June. And I think that the February one is UK and June is the US. That's a bit of an assumption, but that's what I think is happening. Alien 4 comes out in October. And the name change reflects that this is a bit of a musical departure for the band. In Ian Abrams' book, Sonic Assassins, Alan Davey says this: "We had so much stuff left over from It Is the Business of the Future to Be Dangerous. A lot of it's really good, though none of it is rock stuff. Douglas, manager, suggested that we put it out under another name. I think we were trying to slip it into a different market, but it didn't get pushed or advertised." Dave Brock continues slightly later: "We've always tended to experiment and learn the latest technology. It's good to try lots of new things. It's like painting, where you might do loads and throw stuff away, but at least you're doing something. We did have some bits and pieces for a second Psychedelic Warriors album, but they've never seen the light of day, and technology has moved on." So there's not an awful lot of coverage for White Zone in the books, and it does tend to be perhaps slightly passed over. But it's an interesting one, and in releasing it, there are a couple of tracks on it that come from the Dave Brock solo album released the same year called Strange Trips and Pipe Dreams, which we may come to in due course because it's actually rated very highly in his solo catalogue, and I had a quick listen to it and quite enjoyed it. There's also a track on it which is a Richard Chadwick solo track. So that is White Zone. Let's get Matt's hot take on this one before we dive into the track for track.
Besides a few annoyances, I think this is another really fun mixtape style offering from Hawkwind's alter ego, which occasionally fractures off and goes and does its own thing. Given the mixed reviews that we had of It Is the Business of the Future to Be Dangerous, I wasn't sure what a fraction of Hawkwind's psyche was going to sound like, but I think actually it's brought back that mixtape vibe that I mentioned in Church before in a really nice way, but I think this is much more focused than Church as an actual idea of a mixtape, and I think it plows a pretty straight furrow through Hawkwind's current electro space big beat quote-unquote techno but not actually kind of phase that they're in. I think at 45 minutes, it's a good length for something more experimental, and unlike It Is the Business of the Future to Be Dangerous, I think it flies in the face of the pressure that CD buyers were clearly putting on bands to make crazy length albums at this time. So the fact it is only 45 minutes, as we said before for some of their other albums, it gives it that clarity where it doesn't outstay its welcome. It does feel more like an extended jam or something more experimental. It's not necessarily them putting out a full album. And it's difficult to completely describe the feeling that I mean by that, but I'm sure we've all had that feeling before where you listen to an album and it feels like it's something that they did and they want to share it, and it's more of a musical milestone in the road of their progress. Or there's an album where they're like, no, we've carefully crafted this and it's served up in a full production kind of way. You know, this is more of a TV show to the full film that some albums are. But I like it for that, personally. I think it was very bingeable to carry on that kind of modern TV idea. I think it's a shame it never had a vinyl release, actually, because I would have bought this one, even though I think probably CD is the medium that it makes sense to consume it in. It's just funny that actually this one looks cool and has a really interesting vibe to it that I think actually would suit the vinyl format. As a vinyl collector, I always think it's fun to hear very electronically produced things like old school drum and bass or dance records committed to vinyl. There's always that really interesting dissonance between a very old school medium playing music which was made almost entirely digitally. Maybe one day Record Store Day will bring out a version or something. Going actually into the music itself, I think for the second time, I'm reminded of the radio series Blue Jam. We talked about it before once, which combined weird black comedy sketches with scuzzed out trip hop to make this very strange performance art for radio. And there's bits of this which feel that it has that idea again of this kind of big sampley soup where they've taken ideas rather than full tracks and let them play with each other and playing with this idea of loops and what it means to be a band making music in a much more dance focused way, because dance music and techno music and that kind of thing has its own way of doing things. It is a very loopy and riffy based genre. If you find something that sounds cool, you repeat it until you're bored of it and then you move on, and it's less about tracks evolving themselves and more like you listen to something that's been constructed based around one idea, and then when you're bored of that you mix into another idea rather than actually take one idea and explore it in the way that a band normally would. However, there is some of that on this album. So again, it is an interesting mix between them understanding the ideas of contemporary and 1995 electronic music, but also bringing their own ideas with it. So it does feel like a nice mix of Hawkwind adding themselves to it and not just being contained by the rules of the genre. I think this is probably the first time I'd understand the Chemical Brothers reference when we talked about before some of their influences, because there's some parts of this that really feel like they could be likened to something on Dig Your Own Hole or Surrender by the Chemical Brothers, even though those albums aren't actually out yet by the time this dropped. So there is maybe a little bit of precursory vibes going on here. I don't know whether or not the Chemical Brothers ever listened to the Psychedelic Warriors or Hawkwind or were inspired by them. I don't know if they've ever committed that to an interview. I did have a cursory look. I couldn't find anything, but the Chemical Brothers were very good at bringing that kind of 70s psych to a more dance-focused electronic thing. I think in a way they were better at it in terms of they committed much more to the electronic side, where I feel like on the other side, Hawkwind have kept things more in the kind of live band vibe. I don't think either one's right or wrong. It's just interesting that they both came at it from a different way and just weighted one genre against the other. But in general, the sound clash between live rock, synth, samplers, I think gives us a pretty sophisticated and fun, if slightly naive, listening experience. I think more so than anything else they've attempted in the 90s thus far, at least in my opinion. I like the mix between the live and the loop. I think it is bang on for 1995. And I have found that when I did my more deep analysis of the tracks, I found maybe a bit more to pick on in terms of quality. But if you just put the album on and let it play and treat it as this 45-minute little experimental jam, I pick up much less on things that bug me. And I generally find I have an enjoyable 45 minutes listening to it. And I think that is true from the first time I listened to it through to now.
I do compare it to It Is the Business of the Future to Be Dangerous. And I remember that one of the things that we picked up on with that album, which is picked up on by pretty much everyone, it's definitely referenced in Abrams' book, is that It Is the Business of the Future to Be Dangerous has an idea but doesn't commit to it. It has all of this instrumental ambient techno stuff going on, particularly early in the record. And there's a part of you that thinks, just do that, cut it off there at about the 50-minute mark, lose all of the rock ones that you put in later on that feel like they didn't have an awful lot of real passion behind them to us. And this one, maybe it's because it's gone out under a different name, fully commits to being what it is. And I really like that. We're not getting into the individual tracks at this point, but just as a concept, it goes 100% out to be what it is. You're absolutely right. 45 minutes is the perfect time for it. It doesn't see the need to be a full-blown 65-minute album with huge extended tracks on it that have lots of movements from one type of music into another and into another, pieces bolted together, which they did fantastically well on Electric TP, for example. So it's not a bad thing, but it's not what's required in this. The tracks do more or less one thing, do it for 3 or 4 minutes, and then stop doing it, and the next track starts, which works really well. So of a piece, as a package, this actually feels like what they wanted to do but didn't quite do with It Is the Business of the Future to Be Dangerous. And as such, I've definitely developed some fondness for it. And as I say, that's without getting individual tracks. And when we get to the art just completely reflects that. So let's dive in, and we get 1.5 minutes of Am I Fooling?
So we open the album with this very fast fade up into an ominous sounding staccato beat, barely comprehensible whispers, and this deep droney bass, which definitely sets the tone for the record in general well, I think. You then get some tentative synths coming over the top with some sort of whimsically optimistic glitter, I think, with these little pitch bends and clean tones. But overall, it's a mysterious and minimalist opener, which warms your ears up for what's to come. Maybe it's lacking a little personality generally, but I don't mind it as a short intro because we clearly kick things up several gears in the next track. But definitely this is a very small little intro piece. I think probably you could have made the next track, Frenzy, a minute and a half longer and just made that one full track. I'm not quite sure why this is a track in its own right, but it's also perfectly fine on being that because this isn't an album which you skip. You listen to it as one long thing. In a way, this could just be one track in the same way that you get DJ mixes on CD and they are designed to just be put on and played. This is a journey. So whether or not this was a minute and a half or not, it is the start of what we're about to get into. And I think as a way of just warming up the audience or your own ears to get ready for what's happening, I think this is a perfectly fine appetizer.
Absolutely. I totally agree. Serves as quite a nice intro to the 45 minutes that we're going to get. I could be completely wrong about this because I haven't actually compared them, but the immediate reaction I had was that it sounded more like the Hawkwind electronics of Electric Teepee than the Hawkwind electronics of It Is the Business of the Future to Be Dangerous. I'll probably go back and play a couple of tracks and go, oh no, that's completely wrong. But that did occur to me. And it leads us into something which may be more techno, but is certainly not ambient, and that is Frenzy with the double Z.
Yeah, this, I think, is when the album really gets started. You know, we've had our little amuse-bouche, and now we're getting into the meat of it. And the name of the track clearly matches the content of the track. We ram our way out of the last track like a car going through a window. We destroy all memories of Am I Fooling and just get caught up in the frenziedness of this track. Which is funny because the sound production is a little fuzzy on this. I still love a little bit more separation in the sounds as this gets a little bit messy for me between the kick drum, the bass and the guitar. Everything sounds nice enough and doesn't make me hate it, but everything's just a little bit muddy. It's lacking separation. And so I find myself having to listen quite hard to find the interesting things in this swamp of noise. But if I do pay attention to it, I can pick out these loop guitar riffs, these ravey sound effects, these very human drum loops and a twangy bass line that's all swirling around. So, you know, what it lacks in clarity, it certainly makes up for in energy, and I think it sets up a good pace for the rest of the album in general. It also sets up that we're going to be creating this 45-minute long experience, as we just talked about, because, you know, at the end of the track, we fade to this white noise that then turns into this very zippy tone, like when you've turned the loop function of a sampler so fast that whatever you've sampled becomes so fast that it actually basically becomes a new waveform, and then you can play with that. So we go from a sample that gets crushed and crushed and crushed until it becomes a whole new tone, which then transfers us into the next track. So clearly they are paying attention, which they don't always do, to how tracks end and how tracks have a relationship with each other. And I think that's very useful for them to have, especially when you are trying to take people on this kind of longer experimental journey. So I like the fact that they're doing that with this track and with this album in general. I don't know why things sound muddy and then sometimes don't. Definitely there's some tracks which are really nicely separated and have a really nice audio quality, and tracks like this end up sounding like they're playing again in a garage and just have one microphone in the middle of the room which is recording everything, and I ding them on this for doing this in their latest album. So it's clearly something that doesn't bother them, but I don't ever really understand why they are happy to have such an inconsistency in their albums.
If you've got it now and you've got it in 2024, expect it in all the albums in the interim, I suppose. It's probably the warning. But I'm with you. I like a lot of what's going on in here. I listen to the bass quite a lot. It sounds to me like it's a bass guitar rather than the bass being played on a synthesizer. One of the things that I like throughout this album, actually, is the fact that it's not an electronics album just full of electronics and synthesizers and samples and loops. There are guitars. There is actual bass. And I think it makes the sound much more quintessentially Hawkwind than when they do something which is entirely electronic. So I really like that, and I quite liked it later on. I don't know what the instrument is, but there's quite a high-pitched sound that comes in that might be a synthesizer, might be an electric guitar, I'm not entirely sure. But this is indeed frenetic and quite a hard track. It hits home. So something which is a bit of a juxtaposition to what I was expecting, because most of the electronic stuff that I can remember from It Is the Business of Future to Be Dangerous was much more ambient and trancey. And this one has a lot going on in it. And we get Pipe Dreams, which is one of those tracks from the Dave Brock album, Strange Trips and Pipe Dreams. It's not a re-recording, it is just the track lifted and put on this, or lifted from this and put on Strange Trips and Pipe Dreams. I'm not entirely sure which way around it went, but I suspect that it's a Dave track that he's put on this album.
It's got a very Hawkwind, playful track title to it, doesn't it? You know, are these the dreams you've had after you've enjoyed your pipe? I think listening to it, it certainly sounds like it. This, for me, is a really nicely recorded track, and so maybe because it's been lifted and shifted in one way or another, maybe that is why there's a difference. But for me, this has the clarity which I was looking for. I think this is also the first track where there's a clear riff over the other two, which haven't been fully riffy. They're not soundscapes either, but they haven't built themselves around a core sonic theme like this track does. And I think the riff is very nice. It's quite soft in tone, but it pumps along with the kick of the 4/4 bass drum, creating that nice flow and animation as you listen. I thought in a way that the Pipe Dream riff might have the same chords of Death of War from Electric TP. And to go back to your saying that this sounds more Electric TP than It Is the Business of the Future, I would agree on that. And I think Electric TP in general was more musical in that way. And yeah, I haven't checked the chords, but I do feel like even though Death of War was longer with the plodding chords over the poetry, it feels like these are the same chords but just sped up, or at least they have the same vibe if they're not the same actual chords. But either way, I think they're very nice. They're fun to listen to. Like I said, it keeps that rhythm and that pace. It's definitely the most dance music thing they've done so far, because we have this minimal 4/4 kick and shaker rhythm, which gives it more of a techno vibe. Again, I wouldn't quite call it techno, but it's more techno-y than anything they've done before, and I think they've embraced it really nicely. And the track, I think, does a nice job of doing a minimal exploration of itself for the 3.5 minutes it goes on for. You know, about a minute in, a guitar starts to lazily wander around in the top register, which doesn't do a whole lot, but it just adds a little bit of extra detail to listen to. It holds the pace of the previous track nicely, but it's more with the riff and the pumping feeling rather than the crazy freneticness. So I think there's not a lack of intensity, it's just a different type of intensity. But there's this kind of tranquility to it overall with the synth voicing and the pads that build around it, while still keeping a pace. So I think as a 1-2, this is showing a really nice listener flow from our little intro that was a bit creepy and weird to get you into it. Now we're going to establish ourselves with this big freak out, and now we're going to keep that intensity, but we're going to come down without losing the pace. I think it's nicely arranged. I think this track's not bad at all.
Yep, I really like this. I actually really enjoy the guitar. Doesn't have to do too much, but when it comes in, it means the track is evolving rather than just doing the same thing for a few minutes. And I really enjoy the guitar when the guitar comes in. It's interesting, the difference in production, because the fact that potentially this is from the Dave album, if we go along with the fact that this is a Dave record for the Dave album that they've used on this, then it's quite possible that this is recorded at a completely different session altogether, or is accumulated from whatever sources they have at a completely different time than other tracks. So it'll be interesting to see whether that bears out, because obviously there's another track on here which is from the Dave album. But yep, we really like Pipe Dreams, and it's a really interesting start to this record. We get Heart Attack next.
This feels a little bit of a speed bump for me, because we've had a lot of great music, and now we come into Hawkwind's or the Psychedelic Warriors' first skit, which, you know, they like to do. And I think given the fact this is a more of a mixtape vibe, I think it's perfectly fine to throw in random samples and weird ideas and this kind of radio play thing that they like to do occasionally. So I don't mind it from the people who are producing it. For me, it's a little bit of a speed bump in my enjoyment of the actual album in general, because it does kind of put a bit of a blocker on the pace that we've just had. We even have to start by blowing up the previous track. We have this big bit crushed boom sound, which is actually quite nice. There's this aliasing around it, like it's a low quality sample that they put through some big reverb or something, so it makes it feel like it's breaking up after it hits. So that's sonically interesting, I find. But then we go into this skit or sample of someone having a heart attack or saying they have a heart attack in that old radio play style, which never really works for me, but Hawkwind seemed to enjoy it a lot. And then suddenly it switches again into this mid-flight captain's announcement immediately afterwards about a flight from New York to Miami, before there's another little skit about how to use an in-flight vomit bag from an air hostess that sounds like they're trying to do an impression of the Queen or something. It's all very odd, and for me the three things don't necessarily go together quite right. The fact that someone refers to the person having a heart attack as Sir made me wonder if that was actually the pilot and they're doing a "your captain is dead" thing, or whether or not that's someone who just happens to be having a heart attack and then they just cut to a different scene and then they've got this captain talking about stuff. I don't see if there's any connection. I don't know if there's meant to be any connection. I don't know if that's supposed to be a story or just a few things that Hawkwind thought would be fun. The fact it's called Heart Attack means I feel like they're trying to build around this idea somehow, but I don't really get it. But with the Blue Jam reference I gave before, all of these vocal samples or performances or whatever they are all done over these lazy, almost seedy sounding guitar licks, which create this very strange juxtaposition of moods, which I think that Blue Jam was very good at. They were very good at taking very strange conversations, but the weird music they had underneath it just added to the strangeness of the whole thing. So I think this does quite a good job of putting the listener off kilter, because you don't really understand anything, and maybe it's not even supposed to be understood. Maybe it's just supposed to be witnessed or just have happened to you, and if that's what they're doing, then I think it's okay. Without the initial heart attack bit, I feel the pilot announcement would have been maybe more interesting from a contextless example, because flight announcements and those kind of things over moody atmospherics can work as a little palate cleanser. Maybe they're a bit cliche, so maybe they didn't want to do that, but I feel like I've heard those kind of things before, and it's those incidental bits of dialogue which can work by just creating more of a texture than an idea. In fact, there's a website which I do listen to when I work called youarelistening.to, which combines randomly sampled ambient tracks from SoundCloud overlaid with LA Dispatch police scanner.
Yes, you've spoken about this before. I think it was when we did Church.
Right. The fact that, those two things, every time you listen to it, you'll never hear the same thing. And the ambience is giving you lots of space to put a vocal over it. And that's the snatched vocal you get. It's more of a texture and it's interesting. So I feel like there's a bit of that in this, but also with this overacted, I'm having a heart attack thing. It's a difficult one to unpack. Mercifully, the track's very short and it isn't the full intro to Time and Space. So there may be a way to edit some of the bits I don't like out of it if I wanted to make my own version of it, but at the same time, because it flows into Time and Space, it's not something that is easy to remove. I feel like it's something you just have to deal with as a whole experience, like a pineapple slice on an otherwise tasty pizza.
Well put. I always took it that the guy having the heart attack is a passenger on the plane. So the whole thing is set on a plane. But other than the fact that the whole thing is on the plane, the three different announcements or bits of sampled voices, there isn't like a through line in them contextually, other than the fact that they all seem to be on a plane. I didn't mind this too much. I quite like the big guitar stabs that there are during the samples, and it is quite short, so it's kind of a mood piece. I think it would have got on my nerves if it had been one of those tracks that got extended and extended, but it sticks around and it does its bit for a couple of minutes or whatever it is, and then goes into Time and Space. So I quite liked it for what it is. Your Blue Jam reference is absolutely spot on. I remember listening to Blue Jam and being often quite confused by what the dialogue and the narrative was, but being lulled into the weird surreal mood of it because of the music. And this does do a very similar thing in its short lifespan. So, yep, an interesting one. And as you say, the whole thing is kind of an introduction to Time and Space.
Yes, the track Time and Space starts by picking up a drum beat and stereo delay effect into the outgoing part of Heart Attack. And the end of Heart Attack has the flight attendants explaining how to use a vomit bag, which is either sampled from a radio thing or something that they've commissioned. Again, I'm not sure. But they have this thing where they say, if you need to vomit, put your mouth over the bag and vomit like this. And they have this horrible fake vomit sound, which is annoying because in my version, and again, I listen on Apple Music most of the time, and that overperformed, totally unnecessary throwing up sound happens on the Time and Space side of the cut and not the Heart Attack side of the cut, which is really annoying because if I want to listen to Time and Space, it opens with that sound. It's really annoying, especially when you're trying to listen to this to make a podcast about it, because when I'm listening to tracks on a loop to try and write notes about it, that loop goes all the time. So I was getting that really horrific sound every 4 minutes, which was not fun. But oh well. I do like how then the rest of Heart Attack fades out, because there's this kind of delay effect which is being applied to the cabin crew sample because it fades out at the same time. And the fact that the cabin crew has this delay immediately adds to this feeling that it's just a piece of performative weirdness. It has that psychedelic idea that as soon as you add a bit of delay or something to vocals, they become less necessarily about the content of what's being spoken and more about the delivery. So I do like the way it fades out at that time, and then it gives way to this double time kick drum and this rather sedate bass line, which starts to create this nice audio bed for us to settle back into after we've had our skit. And soon enough, we're also greeted by a sustained dreamy synth chord, which is just held over everything else, while some more shakery style percussion zips around. We don't have the intensity of pipe dreams, but we still have a full sonic register around us. We have this double time beat, but it's quite soft, so it's not causing a lot of stress. It's more just picking up a rather fast tempo for its own sake, but it works. Everything has some kind of reverb or delay on it, which blurs the lines around each instrument, which turns everything into this big squashy mass after it's appeared. It falls into this audio bed we're making. So I feel like we are making this big audio couch for us all to just settle into again after we've had our break. So we're not going from our skit back into the same energy of something like Frenzy. We're building it up again through this track. Sonically, it's all very simple. It's essentially a 2-chord track, but it's the incidentals all around it, the blips, the trills, the spirals, the snatch pieces of indistinct vocals that drive interest around it. I think it's a nice way of gathering up everything that it just threw out with its skit and bringing us back into a different mind state as we listen to it. I wonder if they tried it with a half-speed drum and decided whether the whole thing was a bit listless, because the short tappy kicks of the bass drum actually help keep a feeling of structure over everything else, and I think that was probably a good decision. I think if this was at half speed, it might end up sounding a little too maybe ambient or not quite what they were going for. So I think the double time drum beats are useful to at least keep some kind of feeling that we're ticking over and keeping some of the intensity from the previous tracks. But generally I like this one. I think it's simple, dreamy, but intricate. I think it's well arranged. It's easy to zone out and get lost in, and is a nice bridging track between us picking up speed again from where Heart Attack left us before we get into something more meaty like White Zone itself.
So Heart Attack was a little bit of a speed bump for you. Time and Space is a little bit of a speed bump for me. Once all of the Heart Attack bits have faded away, this just felt quite generic Hawkwind doing synthesizers and could have been on either of the previous 2 albums, passing unnoticed on them. You're right that as a bridging track between Heart Attack and White Zone, it actually does a pretty good job. So in the context of the running order of the album, it works perfectly well. But as a track in its own right, it's the first one we've come to where I don't have an awful lot of interest in it. It's not doing enough for me. Perhaps if it had been on either of the 2 previous albums, it would then have gone on for about 8 minutes, and maybe I'd have sank into that mood and gone with it. But because it does that mood and it only does it for a fairly short period of time, I don't really find myself falling into that mood, and therefore it feels like it doesn't go anywhere. You had a completely different response to it, so it's all very subjective. That's probably my least favourite thing on the record so far. But it does take us to the thing which is probably my most favourite thing on the album so far, which is White Zone.
Yeah, I think that this whole album has been building to White Zone since it started. And after I blasted It Is the Business of the Future to Be Dangerous for having a terrible title track, I'm glad to say that the same is not true for White Zone. I think this has a lot going on massively compared to anything else we've listened to. I think everything else we've listened to has been nice, has been fun, has been mixtapey. This feels much more like a full track, and it's the first real substantive piece that we've had from this whole album in lots of different ways. We have interesting samples, we have interesting voices in the synths, we have an A-B section. There's a lot to unpack here. So let's start with the very start, which is the sample of The White Zone is for Passengers Only, No Cargo. I was trying to figure out where this original sample comes from, and according to the San Francisco Municipal Transportation Agency, White Zones provide safe and accessible curb space for passengers to get picked up or dropped off from to minimize double parking by those who are transporting them. So definitely the White Zone is for passengers only and is not for cargo, to avoid things getting all messed up. And from what I've been able to find, it is a recording from LAX airport. I found a clip of the promo film for the actual LAX airport itself on YouTube from 1977, and you can hear it being said as someone goes through the airport there. So clearly it's something which is broadcasted out into LAX itself. It's also used on the film Airplane as a joke, where someone says the White Zone is for loading and unloading only, and then someone else says no, the White Zone is for cargo, and then the other person says no, it's not, and they have this big argument in a very Airplane kind of way. And seeing as Airplane's based at LAX, I'm assuming this either is or was a well-known aspect of LAX. So given Hawkwind's predilection for flights and flying and all that kind of stuff, I'm assuming that Dave or one of the band members heard this enough to find it being a fun inclusion, and definitely sort of fits within the Hawkwind pilot wannabe mythos that we've had before on other things. It's interesting that we had the flight going from New York to Miami, because New York and Miami don't have White Zones, I checked. So I think it's just funny that even though they had the pilot going from New York to Miami, this White Zone track has nothing to do with that skit by the sound of it. The sample is definitely from LAX. So yeah, that's where that came from. I'm sure everyone else knows that, but now we prove that we also know it. We open on this eponymous sample, which sounds like it's been field recorded, as there's a bunch of traffic sounds in there as well. So I can imagine someone from Hawkwind running around with a little recorder making an original field recording of it. It feels like it has some kind of flangey effect on it as well, to add a bit of surreality to the whole thing, which, given the delay on the other vocals from Heart Attack and stuff, I think fits very well with this psychedelic Warriors vibe that we've got. And it goes on for over 20 seconds, so it's really carving out some space between it and the previous track before we're like, all right guys, this is the big track that we're going to drop now. And before it does drop, there's one more sample, and it took me weeks to find where this sample came from, but I found it, and it's weird. It's from a film called Cool World from 1992, which I had never heard of before, but it stars Kim Basinger and Brad Pitt, and it's a live footage / animation hybrid / weird thing in the style of Who Framed Roger Rabbit, but it's a much more surreal, horned up adult version, but it's actually from the same creator as Who Framed Roger Rabbit. It's also way worse in terms of quality, plot, acting, everything. If Channel 5 tried to remake Who Framed Roger Rabbit, they'd come up with something like this. It's really, really weird. And the line Hawkwind uses is, "I could put overtime in on Deeb's boss, I'm tireless," which is from a scene where a Jessica Rabbit style cartoon character is trying to seduce a real person, because in the film, if an animated person sleeps with a human, they become human too, but that's illegal to do so. It's very weird, but exactly the kind of thing I can see Hawkwind watching and wanting to add to their music, even if the line they decided to use is both nonsensical in context of the track and delivered in this comedy tune voice, which for me waters down the artistic quality of what has been a pretty decent track otherwise. With that little bit of detective work done, I guess let's get around to the actual track. As soon as we have this strange quote, we go straight into the track proper. It opens with what I would call some Sega Genesis funk, insofar as the keyboard voices feel very 16-bit and almost video gamey in tone. I feel like I could be playing some kind of side-scrolling beat-em-up while this plays. It's nicely arranged and it's fun, but it's quite funny how dated it somehow sounds now compared to when they were talking about how technology moves on. I think with some electronic sounds, it still sounds quite timeless, but I think this voice that they're using on the keyboard specifically has a very mid-90s vibe to it, in the same way that the 80s can sound very 80s with their snare pads and that kind of thing. This has an odd early Genesis synthesizer vibe to it, and it might sound like I'm down on it for sounding like a video game soundtrack, but as anyone who follows our playlist knows, I see video game music as a legit art form, so I'm not saying it's bad in any way. I'm just saying it's interesting that it just happens to sound like that. But also for me, I grew up around this kind of time, so that kind of music has influenced my musical sensibilities ever since I was a kid, so hearing this definitely works in that kind of mixtape style format for me. Again, to hear it now, it's almost dated enough for it to be cool again. And I think the track would be totally fine as it is, if maybe a little underwhelming if it just did this for a while. But then out of nowhere it drops into this crazy B section which has this synth riff that sounds huge and distorted and floods the audio spectrum with this crackly energy. To me it sounds like a really old inkjet printer. There's printers that had the perforated edges, and when it printed it made the most crazy horrible howling noise. It sounds like if they were able to take one of those and pitch it to what they wanted. It's big and badass, and this bass line hits a few of the chords in this really pleasing way, which brings this riff to this epic resolution on the loops. I think the very first time I heard it, it really pricked my ears up, and I was like, wow, I wasn't expecting that sound, that culmination of chords, the way the bass line, everything comes together. For me, that was really energizing, and still listening to it again, I look forward to it whenever that comes in. And then we have this C section where we go back to the more pared back version of the initial riff, but with this new synth over the top that's playing this more synthetic string section with this really lazy portmanteau between notes, which gives this very languid glide that creates this slight dissonance from resolution from note to note. So once again, we're coming to this really pleasing resolution with each loop, but there's this little bit which always feels a little bit dissonant, which they then always resolve into. And Hawkwind have done this before, and I always think they're very good at creating this dissonance into a very pleasing resolution. So I find this all very gratifying to listen to. The audio range is filled with lots of separation, so everything sounds really nice. You can identify everything. It even goes into this sweet halftime section at the end of the C section, which is a glorious choice for me. Again, it puts a big smile on my face. It's got this big arms out wide feeling to it. It's got that euphoric ability which Hawkwind are able to do, especially with their electronics. I find from that percussive point of view, when we drop into half time, we also get these hi-hats that sound like they're ratcheting, which is very popular now in trap music, when the hi-hats, it sounds like it's being played really, really quickly. So it's interesting to hear that was happening in 1995. And then we move into this D section where we have a guitar come to join the party. I don't like how they just sort of throw the C section away with this very hard cut. I wish they'd faded it or done something with a newfound delay trick or something to make it feel a little bit smoother when the guitar comes in. But I'm happy to live with it. It just harshes my buzz a little bit. But the guitar starts to then make up for it by doing this sort of little exploration over the top of the established riff. And then we pretty much go one more time for a victory lap. We get the evil printer jam to spice things up again. And then we do the C and D sections again to make this tag team over this big long pad. And by that time we're at the 6-minute mark, and the track's starting to feel like it's looking for a way to stick some kind of landing, but it also feels like for a while it ends up in this more holding pattern and just starts piling everything back in to see if there's a way of drawing this out to a suitable climax. And then these vocal samples come back in, the B section comes back in again, but they end up just going on the slightly disappointing fade and cut over ending it or properly mixing it. So I feel like it's underserved as an ending, but I feel like in general the track's got a huge amount of energy to it, and it's made Hawkwind album tracks cool again. It's clearly something that they are really happy with. I feel like it's arranged in a way which makes it feel like they're very pleased with themselves for making it, and I'm pleased with them for making it. Whenever I get to this part of the mix, it's something where I'm like, right, cool, whatever else I was doing, stop, listen to crazy printer music, and have a lot of fun.
This is the other track, which is from Dave's Strange Trips and Pipe Dreams album. I guess it's from the same session as of Pipe Dreams earlier. It's the perfect place for this track as well, smack bang in the middle of the record. It feels like it's needed there, and it is a brilliant high point. The guitar riff in that, for want of another word, I'll call a chorus, is brilliant. Very upbeat. Has a great rhythm to it. Love the guitar solo, and at 6 minutes it's one of the longer tracks on the album, but it doesn't feel like it is, because each time it goes round it's different, it's evolving, as you say. So it doesn't feel like it outstays its welcome. It is the peak of the White Zone album, at least for me. But that is one of the longer expositions on a Hawkwind album track that you've done for quite some time, Matt. So my assumption right now is it is for you as well. It takes us to In Search of Shangri-La, because they found space. So it's about Shangri-La now.
Yes, because as we found out, space is there.
Yes.
And actually, several people pointed out that space is there, and there's a typo in the streaming when it says space is not there. In the original album, it is space is there, which now makes sense.
There you go.
As to when you said the sample is saying space is there, and they're saying space is there, and it was our mess up for not figuring that out.
Yes, absolutely. It's good to know that in the argument between Hawkwind physical product and Hawkwind streaming products, Hawkwind physical products win the day.
And the name of this track tripped me up slightly, as for me Shangri-La is normally 2 words, so I ended up reading this as Shangri-La, which sounds like something Godzilla would fight, so maybe we shouldn't go in search of Shangri-La in case it accidentally ends up destroying a city or something. Weird names notwithstanding, I think this is a nice 1-2 punch of energetic fun for me. We start with some little metallic hats of percussion with a really zingy tight delay on it, so it sounds really fun and just adds to that extra metallic zip that you get when you push a delay to be really, really close to the actual thing it's delaying, which creates this frantic energy at the beginning. Then slowly we build up this deep, punchy bass line and simple but effective drum loop under some twisted horns with a lot of processing on them. That's very reminiscent of the 70s stuff we used to get from Nick Turner back in the day, which I appreciate. This is going to be a very deep cut, which I don't think anyone is going to understand, so I'll drop a link in the notes, but the horns remind me of a drum and bass track by Moving Fusion from 2001 called Lazy Bones, because if you listen to that and then you listen to In Search of Shangri-La, you'll see maybe why I think it's a lot of fun. There's a weird mix of electronic music with weird horns that somehow can create a very fun atmosphere if done right, and I think this is done right. Seeing as we started from total silence from the previous track, we do take our time building up this solid groove over the course of 3 minutes really before we actually get into anything overly musical, so a bit like what we did with Heart Attack, we're kind of building it up and building it up. But yeah, I like it personally. For me it has the flair of what I would call a DJ tool, and a DJ tool is a simple track designed to be layered over other things as part of a live performance, so a DJ can add a bit more personality or extra things over other tracks. DJ tools were very popular in the mid-90s through to the mid-2000s. You don't see them so much anymore. The Chemical Brothers did a lot. They called them electronic battle weapons, and it doesn't feel like you're just playing one track over another. You're making this big miasma of music and really turn DJing from just the act of playing one track after another into the act of live remixing and live performance to where we get to now. So it's interesting that this feels like you could take these horns and kind of blast them over other tracks in a kind of fun way, because the drum beat is simple enough to lay over something else, or just listen to it in its own right, as clearly they've done here. But you know, the simple bass line, the incidental horn stabs, for me makes everything fun. I think it totally works. It's still not what I would call techno, but it's definitely embracing that big beat electro format with some of the other stuff, again in a more early Chemical Brothers kind of way. And then when we get to the back third of the track, we get these really nice bass tones, these simple but rhythmic drums and these long floating pads. That's about when I think we get into a proper dance groove. So it's taken a long time to get to the track in its completion, but I think when it gets there, I think it's really nice, and I feel like we get to a decent climax in terms of everything coming together, and enjoying that for the back third of the track. It's interesting because it still feels like a band made this and not a producer, if you see what I mean. It sounds like it was made to be listened to or performed and not danced to in a club environment, which is totally fine, but it's like what I was saying before, where something like the Chemical Brothers took these sounds and turned them into tracks which a DJ could play and people could not look at the DJ and just be on a dance floor and lose their minds and have fun, where this track still feels like it's designed for a lot of people to be all facing in one direction in a stage and hearing these sounds come at you and be performed physically by people and having that shared experience between producer and listener. And I think that's very much more so where Hawkwind exists, but it's just interesting that I feel like I can pick that up listening to this over other tracks which would exist in this style in 95. But yeah, it's a piece. I think this falls into the mixtape vibe nicely. It's not too short to cause any issue. I think it takes a little while to get where it's going, but I think where it gets to is very enjoyable. So I think it gets a good.
It's interesting that on the last couple of albums, there's been a little bit of expectation, not least of which, from me, of you drawing on some of your electronica dance music references and experience in some of the notes and some of the discussions. But I think even though now we're only on just over halfway through this album, there's been a lot more of that direct reference for you this time than there has been on either of the past two records, which is where we expected to come out. That I find really interesting. In this particular track, I do like the sax. We haven't heard it on the album before, so it's new instrumentation on this track, but it doesn't feel out of place at all. And the build-up is nice. So although it is taking a while to build up to its final form, I don't find myself waiting impatiently for that to happen. Quite enjoying the ride as it takes to get there. I like the synth chords that come in later on, and the drumming at the end is nice. So yeah, this is another strong track, and I think its positioning straight after White Zone is perfect. We next get another little short track, which is Bay of Bengal.
Yeah, some more Bliss Out pads with a slightly vocal or sung quality to them. I'm not sure how they've achieved that, actually. I think it's really nice. It's possible to make vowel sounds from synth tones with resonant filters. You can get that yoy and ow kind of sound, which sounds a little bit vocal. But these are very serene pads, which sound like they have a vocal in them somehow. And I don't quite know how they've done that. So for me, that's very well played and a really nice bit of instrumental voicing from them. There's also another rhythmic tone that serves as this percussive element without having this sort of fast attack. It's more of a pronounced but also more round sound, and it's in key with the pads, so it helps us mark time without interfering with our enjoyment of the peacefulness of the track. You know, it's more of a sonic conductor's baton than an actual rhythmic metronome. Sounds like someone's just sort of hitting a very hollowed out round bamboo tube or something, and I think that was a really nice choice to make to give us something to tick along to, but without actually interrupting the general bliss out that we're going for here. It's not very long, but it sets a nice mood while it's around. I get visions of light rays through clouded skies or figures in flowing robes levitating over salt plains, but that's just me. But I think in the minute and a half that it sticks around for, I think it creates enough sonic interest for me to start to float around and have these thoughts. And it ends on these two distorted words, which I can't quite identify. Possibly it says stand by. But I guess as any way to break out of the track and then go back into the more dancey stuff, then I think that works. But yeah, as a little Hawkwind blip that they, I think by law, are forced to have, it's a nice one.
The word I written down was mystery, because it does feel like there is a sense of this having a mysterious vibe to it and doing quite a job of bringing us into a different mood. So it's definitely a segue, this track. And it does it very well. It doesn't hang around for very long, but it does its bit and does it very nicely. And it takes us on to a track called Moonbeam. And Moonbeam is a Richard Chadwick solo track. And it'll be interesting if anybody out there can help with this, because there was a track listing that I saw that said that this is from Chalice of the Stars. But it didn't mention what Chalice of the Stars is. If you look up Richard Chadwick Chalice of the Stars, there is not a Richard Chadwick solo album. Maybe there is some forum out there that someone once posted on in 2001 or whatever. Maybe there's a reference to this. But Moonbeam apparently is from Chalice of the Stars, and it's by Richard Chadwick. And more than that, I can't tell you.
There's lots of surprises then in this, because I was also not expecting Hawkwind to suddenly start experimenting with trance. And I think this is very trancey tropey here. From the fast arpeggios we have, instead of chords, these deep pulsing bass lines and this quite syncopated rhythm with a lot of repetition. For me, this is cookie cutter trance stylings, without a shadow of a doubt, and very interesting to hear towards the back end of the mixtape suddenly to have this as part of this. But then, as well as making this trancey intro that they have with the fast arpeggios and everything, they then use this very band-style breakbeat instead of a 4/4 kick drum, which you would expect from a trance track. So it's not Hawkwind makes a trance track. It's once again Hawkwind taking the rules from other genres and seeing what happens when they apply it to their process. So I actually thought this is quite interesting to hear. We start off feeling like it's going to be a lot faster, maybe, with this frantic arpeggiation and this very plucky synth voice. But then, as the bass line comes in, it comes in with a much more sedate pace, and a pad comes in to make this big soothing blanket which wraps up all the energy and calms it down. So when the drums do come in to give everything a bit of a push, we've already locked ourselves into a much more moody and dubby track than the first 10 seconds of the track may have alluded to. And I don't mind that at all, actually. I think it's nice to have that little bit of craziness to listen to and appreciate, but then going back into the more psychedelic stuff. I think putting in a huge trance track at this stage of the mixtape would have been a massive shift in tone that we didn't need. So it's nice to have that very energetic breakdown and then go back into the dubbiness. And then when the drums arrive, the track is pretty much complete. There's some of the usual extra squiggly bits over the top to add a little bit of ear candy that we had before, but we don't really go and visit any new ideas like we did with White Zone. We just carry this on for a little while. So I think Moonbeam delivers a moody groove which carries itself well. I don't think it does, a whole lot, but in terms of the dance music sensibilities, I think it does enough, and I think what it does nicely. So as something to add a bit of energy and groove into the latter half of the mixtape of the album, I think it was a good choice, and I think it's executed nicely. So yeah, don't mind it.
It is, and Richard Chadwick is the one in the band who seems to be most immersed in the trance and dance scene. I think a lot of those influences come from him, and therefore obviously he's handling all of the drum programming on Hawkwind albums, which means I think that comes out potentially even more. So of all the tracks, if somebody had said there is a track on this album which is Richard Chadwick, I probably would have picked this one. I mean, it might have been a lucky guess, but it definitely wouldn't have been White Zone, for example, which just feels like Dave Brock to me. So yeah, it's interesting. I didn't dislike this at all, and it did well. Injected a bit of a more up vibe, which I liked. And yeah, very interesting. I'd be interested to hear more if this Chalice of the Stars is a Richard Chadwick album, or if there's more just of his stuff knocking around. I've not heard of it, so we'll see. Maybe someone out there can point me at something. Probably something that I've been staring at for years and just not taken in. It's usually obvious when you miss something like this. So we have 2 tracks left, the first of which is Window Pane,
which is another moody percussive piece that feels more Massive Attack in vibe than anything previous. In fact, I think it might have been this track that inspired me to think about adding Massive Attack finally to our sessions playlists, because the bass line of this is less of a tone than we would normally get from a Hawkwind or Psychedelic Warriors track. This bass line is much more of a low, cavernous rumble in a very modern dub Massive Attack style, something that's felt rather than heard, which is really cool, very atmospheric. I love that kind of stuff. I think it's a great way of setting a very dark tone, but still at the same time having lots of intrigue and lots of character. And the percussion, I think, is very sparse but varied. So there's lots of wood blocks, tablas and shakers, which help create interest. And then we have these very long chord pads, because of course we do. But it's the percussion and the bass on show at the beginning of the track that really makes this something special, I think. And then at some point we just break into a bit more of a complex beat with hats on the 8th notes and a big snare, which I like, but nothing more tonal comes along with it. So I feel like we're left in this very K-hold low-end workout overall, which again has that very trip-hop kind of vibe to it. Yeah, I think in general it's got a very different but very subdued and interesting vibe to it. If you compare it to, something like Frenzy, it's interesting that we've gone from there all the way down to this. It does feel like in the arrangement of this and in the mix we are coming down to land. It's kind of starting to think about letting us go as a listener. this might be very weird to say, but the chords sound like they could be based on War Pigs. I feel like I can sing War Pigs over this in a very weird, dubbed out, doomy way.
That is quite the reference. I must admit that had not occurred to me, but the fact that it hasn't occurred to me does not for even a split second mean that it is not true. Yeah, that's intriguing. Weirdly, Windowpane starts off and it's quite a low vibe for a little while. And just at the point where I thought I could do with this kicking up a notch, it did. All this kind of energy comes in and you get that really interesting rhythm. And as you say, all the different percussive elements coming to the fore. It doesn't do quite enough with those elements for me. I was thinking that they might build something melodic on top of that, which they don't. It doesn't mean I dislike it in any way. I just felt maybe that there was an opportunity to go further because I do like that rhythm and it's interesting. There's a lot going on in there. So Windowpane is interesting. You use the term like a mixtape vibe, and it has that to it. It feels like it's like a scrapbook item in the track list. And it brings us to the closer, which is Love in Space.
We wrap this up with a very quirky little number, which I actually like quite a bit. I think the riff that the whole track is built around is gooey and gloopy and swaggers about like a train of camels made of jelly or something. You know, it feels like it's all kind of going in a particular direction, but in a very sort of weird, wobbly way, which I really like. And like White Zone, the bass does a really good job of accentuating a few notes in the riff, which I find, again, really satisfying. And I really like it when Hawkwind do this, and I can listen to it slop about quite happily for the whole 5.5 minutes it's around for. The track is clearly constructed around this weird riff. You know, the drums are there, but they stay out of the riff's way, opting for a short kick and little percussive plinks to add this slow marching feel that we have going on without getting in the way of the main sonic event that we have. And then we have some other little synth voices that swirl around the main riff, like Mist Through a Forest. There's this jittery synth at the beginning that plays in that deserty minor key for a bit, which I quite like, and then there's this more harsh resonant pad that takes over around the halfway mark. But again, all the way through it, there is just that riff which lumbers through the track like the proverbial 800-pound gorilla made of lava lamp wax. You know, nothing's going to stop it or get in its way until it decides we're done. I think it was a good choice to put this at the end because it definitely stays with you after it's over, at least for me. And largely, I think it does a good job of summarising the vibe of the whole album, with none of the odd samples to ruin it, none of the weird cuts, none of the fades. We're just having fun through this whole track, and we even close on what sounds like this heavily filtered resonant saw synthwave on the bass and the treble, which for me is this worthy homage to the early 90s rave scene. And then we're out. And I think that this track has stuck the landing really nicely, considering that we are a largely instrumental album that is very vibe based. I think there's clearly a few tracks which are definitely tracks in this. You know, we've talked about White Zone clearly being one of those. I would argue that Pipe Dreams definitely has that feeling to it. Probably something like Windowpane has a different way of looking at that, but I think it's very nicely constructed. But I think Love in Space is definitely up there in terms of tracks which are fully blown ideas, and to put this at the end and give us something to finish off really nicely with, I think was a great choice. So yeah, I think this is a really good way of finishing that 45 minutes. I think it absolutely sticks that landing of taking us through a little audio journey as one continuous movement of ideas, and just finishing us off to the point when I was reviewing this, when I got to the end of this, I was quite happy to press restart and listen to it all over again.
That's something I definitely can't compete with. We've had Train of Camels made from jelly and an 800-pound gorilla made from lava lamp wax. So it's hard to add to that. It does do a really nice job. You definitely find more hidden in this music than tend to leap out at me, which I think is symptomatic of our diverse musical upbringing, although we've obviously come together a lot more in recent times. You're able to pick out more references than I do. But you're right in that it does a nice job of winding the album. With Electric Teepee, we had a closer which was unsatisfactory in the context of the record. I think with It Is the Business of the Future to Be Dangerous, the last 2 or 3 tracks, particularly given that you had Gimme Shelter sort of sandwiched in the middle of it all, was not a fantastic way to close out that album. And both of those albums were really, really long. And you do suffer from, I think, fatigue with those kind of albums, that you're really waiting for really long albums to end, even if you've enjoyed them. This one you can go back to and play again, which we have to, as we're doing these. You probably have to a lot. I have to on albums like this, which I don't know anywhere near as well as I do a lot of the other albums. But yes, it brings things very satisfactorily to a close. It doesn't leap out at me as a track. It's not one that I remember, when thinking about the album, but it does a nice job of closing things out and bringing us to a very good way to finish our 45 minutes. So that is the music of White Zone. And given that I think White Zone is a very comprehensive little package, takes us to the artwork, which is interesting. Now, I could not find any credit for an artist for any of this. And I did try. So if anybody, again, knows who did this, it's not on the credits for any reference to the album that I could find. But it's really interesting, isn't it, Matt? It seems really fitting to the music.
It does. It's got a very mid-90s grunge style to it. I was looking at this thinking it's got mixes of maybe Terminator 2 mixed with a bit of Seven, all these glitchy, scratchy, sinister ideas of technology, and I guess the early stages of computer-based photo manipulation. I don't know whether or not this was done in an analog way or a more layered early Photoshop way, but we have very clearly a circuit board which is sort of breaking apart and turning into glitchy, noisy sine waves and more like musical waves. If I saw this out of nowhere, I would guess I was going to get something a bit grungy, a bit distorted, definitely electronic. It looks a little bit like early Prodigy work. I'll put on the YouTube version of this, definitely. The early Prodigy singles like Charlie had these very high contrast black and white prints, which are around this kind of time as well. And if you compare that to something like White Zone, I think they fit very clearly in that way. I think the actual mixtape you get is maybe about half the intensity as maybe the cover might start to suggest, but in general I don't think I would feel missold if I just grabbed this and started listening. I love the fact that White Zone is out of focus but feels like it's lifted off of the plane of the circuit board, like it's coming towards you but you're looking past it still. These strange additions of this scribbly 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, I don't know why it's there, but it's cool. There's almost what looks like a serial number that you can't quite identify that's being lost in the noise on the left-hand side. It's got a lot of details in it which, when I think about the intro to Seven, there's a lot of those details which don't mean anything but you somehow feel them, and they're just very good at conveying a mood. And I think everything this does is great at conveying this mood that you're going to go through a audio experience, which I think is very of the mid-90s bands that were trying to create something a bit more dirty and grungy in their own right with electronics. So I feel like this fits really nicely. White Zone looks like it's the same font as it is The Business of the Future to Be Dangerous, while the Psychedelic Warriors looks slightly different, but definitely in that same slightly digitally ilk, which I think works perfectly. The text on the back definitely still has that electronic thing, and even on the inside of the CDs itself has lots of solarized images of circuit boards, and even the CD itself looks like it's already spinning before you even take it out to put into your player, so it already looks like it kind of wants to be played already, even when you're just holding it in your hand, so there's some interesting kinetic energy through the whole thing. It's very different from the last two albums they've done as Hawkwind. This definitely looks like it is a fraction of their id wrought large as a different thing with the Psychedelic Warriors. But yeah, it's a piece of artwork which is a companion piece to what you're listening to. I think it's really good. I'm a fan.
I haven't seen anything that is as accurate a representation of the music as this from Hawkwind as a cover for a long time. Funnily enough, you talked about having this as a vinyl. To me, this screams cassette. We've been to so many gigs where the bands haven't got albums out, they've done their own tapes, and you pick up the tape for a $5 or whatever, and it's printed out in black and white with a cover you can barely make out what it's supposed to be. And this is that to me. The fonts for White Zone and Psychedelic Warriors are both early 1980s computer fonts. They don't seem particularly 90s to me. So they're fonts, particularly White Zone, fonts you would use to be on the readouts of computer screens in movies from the 1980s. the image itself, I didn't pick up on the front cover that it was a circuit board for quite some time. To me, it had a feel of white noise. And again, that to me is a 1980s thing, because when we had computers in the 1980s, you would plug them into the TV. So the TV was the monitor. And you plug it into the TV and you get white noise. And then when you were loading something, you get these black and white bands going up and down the screen. So white noise from a visual point of view just feels very 80s, feels very computery, feels very glitchy, which is what the album represents. So it's funny how this to me just works beautifully as a package, because the music is utterly consistent and committed to its theme, which is probably why they've packaged it out there as Psychedelic Warriors. And going with the black and white and the starkness of it and the high contrast, everything in it ties it to a particular idea and a particular concept. And I think it's done really, really well. Just feels mixtape in every conceivable way. You put the image of the Prodigy cover in our deck of notes that we refer to. And yes, it is very similar. Not in the fonts or anything else, but in the style of artwork. So I really like this. It does feel like a concept that is actually seen through from beginning to end musically, and then through the packaging and everything else. And I'd like to get hold of it, actually. I've got a vague memory of having had this, but I don't know where it is and I don't know what happened to it. So it may be that I'm just inventing that memory from seeing all the imagery now, but I probably will try and get hold of it, because I'm definitely more interested in this, having gone down the rabbit hole on it for the podcast, than I ever was before. I kind of knew of it and I'd heard it a few times, but as a whole thing, it definitely stands up, and I rather like it. And it does stand out on its own, as opposed to, say, when we did 25 Years, when they were Hawklords, and then Church of Hawkwind when they were Church of Hawkwind. They still sounded like Hawkwind albums that just fitted in the lineage of Hawkwind albums before and after them. This one does feel like it's out on its own, being its own little thing to the side.
I hope we do get to find out who was responsible for it, because it really does feel like it's captured very faithfully that grungy punkness that some electronic artists really gravitated towards. I think because, from what you said, that electronic artists, bedroom producers, those kind of artists who didn't have punk growing up and weren't part of that scene, they needed a new visual way to express themselves. And that idea of graphic manipulation, going very stark, playing with the beautiful errors that computers can give you, became part of their visual language. And as you said, that idea of mixtapes where, you know, this has that almost like Xerox vibe, that you could just print off a whole bunch of these at work while no one was looking and give them out to people, rather than it's overproduced in that way. I think it very faithfully captures that vibe. So I'm quite impressed that they were able to come correct when it came to producing an album, because they could have produced something in the style of Electric TP and It Is the Business of the Future, and I don't think it would have serviced them at all. So even if this is deliberately trying to hide who they are with their different name and their different aesthetic, I think someone has put a lot of effort into understanding what that audience was that they were trying to break into, as you got from that quote. I think they've done it with a lot of faith, and it hasn't been done with cynicism. You know, I think it's been done clearly with some heart. Maybe it's because it's hitting me in my personal feels, but it's one of my favorite visuals that they've created.
Yeah, agreed. So that is the music and the cover of White Zone by Psychedelic Warriors, aka Hawkwind. It's interesting, this album doesn't get an awful lot of love. There are some reviews out there, not very many of them. There's not much written about this, full stop. But where you can find some listener reviews, they're generally quite downbeat. In Ian Abrams' book, Sonic Assassins, he says, "In truth, it's a pretty inconsequential record. Not much noticed at the time, not much cared for when it re-emerged as part of Cherry Red's catalogue reissues in more recent times. If we think of it as a Hawkwind album, then it vies for the title of most forgotten. If we pass on it as part of a main catalogue, then it holds scant interest as a side project. In Elric Newby's book, Hawkwind Fans Worldwide Facebook Top 40 Albums, it doesn't feature at all, which is interesting given that it is the business of the future to be dangerous. Ended up as a net 17 above Church of Hawkwind, Xenon Codex, Sonic Attack. And I don't know whether that's because Hawkwind fans on the whole don't really know about this, haven't had a copy of it, aren't streamers and don't stream it, haven't gone looking for it, don't regard it as being canon, or have heard it a lot and really hate it. Is really hard to say, but it kind of feels to me now, and I probably was like that. It wasn't that I hated it, I just didn't really give it much of my attention. Whereas now I think I feel very differently about it, having gone through this journey of evaluating it and then chatting it through with you. And it'll be very interesting to hear from people, I think, as to how they feel about it. So in summing up on White Zone, Matt, any closing thoughts on it as an album, as a package?
I can maybe see why people who like Hawkwind aren't a huge fan of this, because it is so different. Even with Hawklords, like you said, it was them playing with band members to make similar music rather than go out in a completely different way. And if this was just a mashup of tracks from other ideas and things that were swept off the cutting room floor of It Is the Business of the Future to Be Dangerous, maybe people don't see it as a album that was created in the same fashion as some of their others, you know, which are definitely made as albums. This feels more like a little extended blip, but I personally don't mind that. I feel like it falls more into my kind of listening. It clearly triggers some things which I like more, but I can see why maybe people thought the Hawkwind should maybe stay a bit more in their lane, or like you said, because Hawkwind didn't put their official name on this, maybe it's something which fans don't necessarily attribute to them and therefore don't want to consider it. There are plenty of bands that have done solo projects and have been met with very different reviews where people want them to go back and do what they are good at doing. But they went and did it anyway, and they gave it a try. And I like where this went. I don't want them to be doing this forever. I think it's nicer for them to go and be themselves again and take some of this learning and put it into what they normally do. But for me, this is one I will definitely come back to. It's a fun thing to have. I even drove from Berlin all the way to Prague a couple of weekends ago with my family who came to visit, and I put this on in the car and didn't mention what it was, and no one batted an eyelid that it was in the mixtape of everything else I was playing while we were driving. So I think it can still work. I think it still holds up. And yeah, I think as a blip, as an experiment, if you do think of it as a mixtape, if you do think that it is grabbed from lots of different places and lots of different ideas, and listen to it with that in mind, I think it's a fun way to spend 45 minutes. I think if you listen to it as an album and judge it against some of Hawkwind's other amazing albums, then you are going to be found wanting. But I think putting it out there was the right decision. Whether or not they needed to disguise themselves, I guess maybe that's because of the release schedule. If they're also releasing another album, and if they've just released some other albums, this may have been too far a veer of course. I guess I'll be able to say whether or not I completely agree with that when I listen to Alien 4. But I think as a thing to throw out there, I'm glad they did. And it's interesting that Wikipedia thinks this is canon, because it does feel like a blip, but it's a cool blip.
Very well put. If somebody said to me, it sounds like you love White Zone. Well, I wouldn't say that I love White Zone, but I have developed a certain fondness for it, for being what it is, and being what it is very authentically. So it wouldn't be in a top 10 of my favourite Hawkwind albums or whatever. But certainly I'm happy that we've done this, so I regard it. I actually do regard it, as opposed to disregarding it, which I'd kind of done for the rest of the time. It would be interesting, just completely psychologically, to know how I would feel about this if it had Hawkwind on it instead of Psychedelic Warriors. These things do make a difference. It shouldn't. But they're albums I like by bands. And I know that that's because I like the band. And were the album not by that band, I would think it was pretty average. And I can't help that. That's a psychological thing. But this actually does not have that band name on it. It's different. And maybe that gives me an opening to kind of appreciate it more. So Yeah, really interesting little exercise and maybe one to reconsider. So, open questions. Who did the cover art? What on earth is Chalice of the Stars? Hopefully we will find out. In the meantime, Matt, the Hawkbinge master playlist on Spotify, the one track from each album that represents it for you. What is it from White Zone that makes it in?
It's going to be White Zone, and I don't think that was a surprise to anyone. It's a really interesting track in lots of different ways. Strange sample notwithstanding. It goes in multiple directions. It's one of the tracks which, if you put Hawkwind on this album, it's still one which you would say that's Hawkwind. I think the fact that you go from A to B to C to D section shows the variety that the whole band is involved in it, and it's not just something which someone else has done and thrown this in. The use of however they got that screaming printer from hell sound is so unique, it just has to be documented. But as a track in its own right, it's got a nice groove to it, and generally the output is a really interesting track which I have been able to put on repeat while I made notes and listen to it probably 5 or 6 times without even really realising I was. Horrible throw-up noise at the beginning notwithstanding.
Well said. Yep, had to be. And what will join White Zone on the Hawkbinge Sessions playlist alongside all of those turntable picks that we had at the top of the show?
There were a few in contention, actually, but I am going to go with Love in Space. The way that Hawkwind stick the landing of this album, I still think is a lot of fun. I think it's just got a lot of swagger, a lot of attitude to it, which I always get caught up in. And like I said, when the track's finished, I do find myself thinking about it long after. I listen to a lot of instrumental works because I am a writer by trade, therefore I tend not to listen to things with vocals in it when I'm working, because I find that the vocals often mess with my thought patterns. So that's probably why I lean more instrumental in what I listen to anyway. But also it's fun as a writer to be able to listen to tracks and try to manifest what you're hearing, which isn't then idea and vocal based, into a way to try to convey that to people. And when I can unashamedly use phrases like 800-pound gorilla made out of lava lamp wax, then you've clearly made a track which is interesting and has opened my mind up in weird ways. So definitely I think Love in Space is a great contender. Was sadly never good enough to oust White Zone as a master playlist pick, but definitely for Sessions I think it's a really good runner-up.
Sounds like a good set of picks. I'll leave you again with the fact that our boutique collection over at SkullPrint, go over to SkullPrint if you want to see and buy Hawkbinge merch. And remember that being a proudly money-losing operation, all of the money that comes to Hawkbinge will go straight to the British Bee Charity to help them and the environment. And on that note, we're not really going anywhere because we're just going to stay in 1995 for a few more months so that we can get to Alien 4. And quite what happened to the first 3 aliens, I'm not quite sure. Perhaps we'll find out. See you then. Technicians of Spaceship Earth, you have been listening to Hawkbinge, the Hawkwind podcast. It was devised and presented by Andy Hood and Matt Longstaff. The soundtrack was produced by Dissonant. To contact the show, drop us a message on Facebook, Instagram, or X, the artist formerly known as Twitter, by searching @Hawkbinge, or send an email to podcast@hawkbinge.space. Hawkbinge is a proud member of the Deep Dive Podcast Network. To find more great band and music-focused podcasts like this one, head to @DeepDivePodNet on Twitter and dive in. Thank you as always for listening. We'll see you next time.
So we have this kind of almost blue jammy sort of performance because, sorry, 1 second. Hello.
There's a thunderstorm coming. Can you take 2 minutes and help me?
Yes, of course. Sorry, I have to quickly batten down the hatches. There might be a thunderstorm.